Okay, here we go. Okay, what have you been up to, Jeff?
What have I been up to? I've actually, we're fully into full-throated spring here in Vancouver. So I've been wandering out and doing lots of different kinds of shots of things. Been had a great day yesterday because I went out a couple different times for different purposes, always with the camera. And last night I went out to a jazz concert and I
Oh,
got out there about a couple hours ahead of when it started. So I was wandering around downtown with a really a black and white camera that captures light in a wonderful way, and kind of wandered around the city taking shots, and afterwards walked home partly, and through the city at night. So that's really a lot of fun with the camera, I find. So just a lot of that kind of stuff. And they just started a scooter program, those rental like Lime
oh yeah,
scooters in
Lime and
Vancouver here.
yeah.
So they've been piloting it, and they do it so that you actually have to take the scooter to a stand. You can't just dump it wherever you want, which is an
Well, that's
improvement.
good.
But I've been hopping on these scooters, going to interesting neighborhoods, and then doing photo walks. So I'm just hopping to a lot of neighborhoods recently, which
Yeah, they
is
are fun. We've had them
yeah,
here in Bloomington for a few years.
yeah. So that's been fun. I'm not quite so stupid, I think is the right word to have the camera out of the bag while
Hmm.
I'm on the scooter, so I can just stop or take a picture on the fly. But I've been known to do things like that on a bike, which is also stupid.
Yeah,
But how about
yeah,
yourself? Yeah. Apart from being quarantined on the side of a cruise ship,
yeah. Back to the scooter thing. I had to lay one down once a few years ago because it was kind of wet, and you could find
right?
them all over a neighborhood. So I just picked up one up to go to work. It's like a less than 2 mile ride to work. And then I was going down this hill, and the brakes didn't work.
Oh no.
I was going faster and faster, and there's like a real busy intersection there. So I just had to lay it down. I didn't get hurt, but
Wow, that's lucky. I have noticed a couple times I've skidded to a stop. They're not necessarily the most robust platforms. And I think, because they're not yours, you're just hopping on something you don't know anything about, like, the tire inflation or the quality of the brakes
yeah,
or that. So it's, they have them governed so they can only go so fast. And then they've got the geo fence, so only certain parts of the city work. But for me, it's fantastic because I can jump to like three or four great areas to go on walks around here, which has been a lot of fun.
yeah. I think it's a great feeling too once you finally get the feel for it. Within like
Yeah,
5 minutes, you're going, "Wow, this is cool."
yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
it's a
for
nice way to
me,
scoot around.
yeah. I mean, they also have a lot of electric bicycles. I think that's
Yeah,
even, and actually, when I was in Paris, the scooters and electric bicycles were everywhere.
yeah.
Um, but as far as what I've been doing, last weekend I went to Boulder, Colorado where there's a friend of ours that had a memorial service, and I was taking some, landscape photography in there in the Flatiron Mountains in Chautauqua. And the Monday morning we were getting ready to fly back later in the evening. My plan was to get up at 6 a.m. and drive up to Boulder Falls, which is this really neat waterfall. It's kind of in a
Mhm.
notch, and it's got this extraordinary, like 8 mile long rapids
Oh
afterwards.
my gosh.
So it's really looking forward to getting some moving water, you know,
Hmm.
time exposure and stuff. But that morning, I was just blah. I thought I was just getting a cold.
Hmm.
But then when I got back Tuesday, I tested for COVID. Sure enough,
Right.
and I'm on Paxlovid, which my last dose was this morning. Excuse me. One of the side effects here, but the Paxlovid sort of makes you kind of dizzy
Hmm.
and your rumbly stomach and stuff like that. So, but I feel very energetic right now.
Well, good. Yeah, it's interesting. Waterfalls are such a there are lovely waterfalls all through the province here, and it's really interesting how different it can be if you can get really, really close to them, or like their sighting and how you can view them have a lot to do with what's possible. Some of my favorite ones are ones where you can actually walk right in the riverbed. There's a
Yeah.
place not far from Vancouver called Shannon Falls, so There's this huge escarpment, and over millennia, water has been shooting through from a glacier, and there's a beautiful waterfall. But then when it's really wet and the spring runoff and such, whole trees shoot out the top of that
Oh,
fall,
wow.
over time. So at the bottom of the falls, you have this kind of chaotic scene of, rock and wood destruction in the river that goes. So, the best thing to do is to get in the river and kind of boulder your way as far up as you can go. And then shooting the falls like that is a lot of fun,
Do
and
you,
also a bit of an adventure. So
do you
I
ever use those
enjoy that.
wader things with the big rubber boots with the suspenders?
Well, it varies a little bit in terms of the time of year as to whether or not you'd even venture, under the falls because of the flow of the water. But no, you can typically kind of pick a path through the debris. So you're climbing on boulders and then climbing on logs, and you're kind of making your way. So you don't typically have to get wet, but if you go in the summer, you might want to because it's a nice way to stay cool. But
Yeah.
then there's another waterfall up. We were camping near Wells Gray Park, and it was a really cool one because you could, like, rather than being at the bottom of the escarpment, you were actually on the top of the escarpment, and you could walk right onto the top of the falls. And so I'm perched like right over the edge, looking down over this roaring falls, taking pictures, and you're right in the river at the point that it's breaking. So again,
It's
it's
slippery?
just um, oh, probably slip. Of course, it's mossy and slippery. It's all kinds of things. So my partner was not at all pleased that I was, right
Yeah.
at the edge there. But I mean, again, it's what's interesting because when you talk about with rapids and moving water, boom, there's so many possibilities. And then when you add perspective and, the force of gravity in terms of the spray and the mist and all the other pieces to it, waterfalls are just endlessly fun.
Yeah, and the spray gets on your lens from everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've
When then all
discovered,
the negative ions close to the falling water, that's all energizing too. So yeah, it's a good place to be with the camera.
yeah, and I think that people you often get the wide shot, which is mandatory, of course.
Yeah.
But if you can zoom in on sections, I mean, there's
Yeah.
so many things, so many possibilities.
I had one shot where I can't remember if this was from above or below. I think I was below, and I had a modest telephoto on, like a 90 millimeter lens maybe. But there was a row of people, so a couple folks, a couple kids, and a dog, like right on the edge of the fall. So like it was kind of pretty dramatic to see them up there like that. But then later on, I could shoot from behind, from where they were too. So
And probably,
once I
especially
saw
at
them up
90,
there,
a long lens would make that a little bit more exaggerated with how
yeah,
close they were to the edge. Yeah.
yeah, because of the compression. But yeah,
Mhm.
so but again, I mean, it's kind of interesting how there's a lot of shots like that you see that are just kind of that off in the distance, the kind of postcard image, and then there are ones that are a little bit more involving because you get a sense of the spray, you get a sense of the vertical, you get
Yeah.
the other components.
What I usually try to do is look for those postcard shots to begin
Hmm.
with, just to get warmed up, just
Yep.
to get it out of your system. And so, half the time those are okay. But then as you're doing that, you start looking out of the corner of your eye, you start seeing things. And what about that spot over here? Or what if I should there? What if I
Hmm.
zoomed in on this? That's when your brain starts to do the work trying to create these views.
Yeah.
But to just to
Well,
jump and try to do automatically, just try to find those intricate sections, that's
yeah.
almost impossible to do.
And we've had several folks share recently waterfall pictures from Yosemite and other places. And, again, it's this lovely. What's that one in Yosemite, where the flame comes? So
Oh
we
yeah.
had one of that. I saw a video of that the other day where, you actually see the light transition to turn that into a flame. And that's really cool.
Yeah, they've been doing that from way back. I remember seeing an
Yeah.
old 1940s newsreel where they have a color with the flames coming down that waterfall. And also, I've discovered, like at Boulder Falls in particular, where you have this horizontal rush of water that's really fast. You can see spray going over these rocks and stuff. You can actually take stitched panoramas,
Mm,
and the blending works great. I mean, there's a couple of places where that might be kind of like, oh, well, that doesn't match, but it's very easy to touch out.
yeah.
So I strongly recommend people try to do that because it's so forgiving. The
Hmm.
software that blends it works so well.
Right. I saw someone put together a project with obviously multiple shots that was really nice because they made it really obvious that it was, stitched together with, let's say, 30 shots, and they were zoomed in a bit, but then you saw the missing sections of it. So you had kind of an irregular kind of outside frame to it, kind of showing, whatever view that they wanted with the combined shots. But the artifice of it as a stitched panel was part of the image itself in the way they presented it, and aesthetically it was really pleasing.
Yeah. And but I was surprised how well that worked, and even with long exposures. Actually, it was easier with long exposures because
Yeah.
you had enough blur there to make it easier for that to try to figure out what's supposed to melt together.
Yeah, but it's always worth stopping on the side of the road where there's a waterfall or a river moving down some elevation. You
Yeah, I
always
like
need a
that.
treat there.
Boulder Falls is this windy road that goes up Canyon Boulevard. And in the summertime, you can, I mean, especially in the weekends, you'll see rock climbers hanging like Christmas
Oh
ornaments
my
on
God.
the sides of the rocks above there. But there's this stream uh, that what weaves back and forth through this windy road, and lots of pull offs. You can kind of scramble down there and get waterfall shots or mountain stream shots.
Hmm.
But I came up with a bunch of questions of things to talk about. And one of them was to start out with kind of an obvious one. If I can get my Evernote up here. There it is. Like, how did you get started with photography?
Oh my gosh. Well, that goes back a long time ago. So I, basically picked up a camera when I was, well, I mean, I probably was interested in photography before I was in high school, but in high school, I really started getting interested. So I, joined the club. I learned how to do some pretty rudimentary darkroom stuff in that context. And then I would, just shoot a lot of pictures. I, as a graduation gift, my parents gave me a Canon AE1 program.
Oh
That was a
yeah,
pretty hot camera at the time. And so I just was shooting with that whenever I would travel, and really it was just a matter of I always enjoyed taking photographs full stop, but also doing a lot of candid images. So when I'd go to an event or something, I'd be taking pictures. When I would travel, I would be taking pictures and just taking pictures. And so I think I came by it very honestly as kind of threaded it into my life as a hobby, and I don't know that it rose to pursuit, but it was kind of an abiding interest of mine. So it's always, just been something that I've done, I suppose. But more recently, I've gotten a little bit more attentive to it, and a little bit more focused on trying to maybe improve my abilities a little bit and just improve my eye more than anything else.
yeah.
But
So,
you,
well, yeah, I got started. Yeah, my grandfather was a Navy photographer, and
hmm.
he was too old to actually go to World War II, but he was an instructor.
Hmm.
He moved to Hollywood, Florida to do that. But he did a lot of Navy photography. I got this really great album where this was probably taken in the early 30s. They did these photo albums of the ceremony when they crossed the equator,
All right.
the Neptune something or other. And these guys were Hawaiian skirts and things like that, all these sailors on board ship. But anyway, of course, he had a real severe interest in photography. He had his own darkroom. And he took me to his dark room when I was probably like 7 years old, 8 years old, and he showed me how he created photographs. And I remember seeing that rolling that paper over in the tray, and I
Hmm.
saw images all of a sudden appear out of white paper,
Oh,
and
magic.
so I was hooked at that point. And so I tried to, and that's probably a year or so later. I was probably 9 or 10. I constructed my own dark room on my parents' basement. Not I wasn't really much of a construction. It was a table with ice cube trays and things like that. And I tried to keep the basement windows light, keep the light out of it and stuff like that. But I created my own images with other people's negatives, like my parents' negatives and so forth. So I wasn't really interested in photography. I was interested in darkroom work, which
Interesting.
I pretty much did until the late, like 1969 or 70 is when I really started thinking I needed to get more into the other end of this.
Hmm.
And and by that time I was a little bit had more a little bit more elaborate dark. I had a regular enlarger and I had, the bamboo tongs and safe lights and so forth. And so I ended up with a my something I got inherited from my grandfather after he died was a Kowa fixed lens 35 millimeter camera that was that I used a lot. And it was kind of frustrating because, of course, it was a fixed lens and it wasn't a great camera, but it did okay. And I ended up getting an old used Nikon F
Hmm.
that I then and it developed a light leak, and I've still got that camera around somewhere. Which I eventually in 1976 I got a Nichromat EL, a brand new one. So that was a wonderful camera. Um, and all through that I would did darkroom work. And in 1978, I moved to a house after I was married and already had a child. We moved to a house that upstairs was previously an apartment, so we had an extra kitchen upstairs. Perfect for converting to a dark room, hot
Hmm.
and cold running water, refrigerator, everything else.
Oh, perfect.
So I did all this elaborate. I was able to do this. It was like heaven almost, having this perfect dark room. And I moved on into color photography, color darkroom work. And so I was really getting a ball rolling on that when I volunteered to do a wedding in 1978. And that from that point on, that's all I did.
Hmm.
It seemed like a good idea at the time, and I was making money with it. But then that's the only thing I did.
Hmm.
So by the time I hit I shot over 300 weddings by the
Oh my
time I hit
gosh.
1992, and I was so burned out on it. I mean, and I did all my own darkroom work, creating all the prints and everything, color, and I just completely quit. I was no longer interested in I was interested in photography, but I was no longer interested in doing that grind anymore.
Yeah. I've heard
And
that from a lot of wedding photographers that I
oh
know.
yeah, I mean it's there's a lot of fun to it too, but it's a
Yeah.
lot of pressure,
Yeah.
especially when you have to develop all the film.
Well, especially when you're shooting film.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for folks who do that. Like I've only ever been just kind of an informal, like a guest with a camera, and I would share whenever I go to a wedding, I would share all of those pictures with my friends or family, and so that was appreciated. But yeah, for the person who actually is being paid to get the shot, I expect that that's an anxious day.
Yes, and I was pretty lucky. I was pretty careful because there are horror stories about losing the film,
Hmm.
ruining entire rules of film and so forth, especially if you develop your own stuff. So I never ran into any problem with that. But and it was a good in retrospect, it was a very good experience of learning how to use a camera.
Yeah.
You had to know what you every day. It was sort of like people if you play guitar, that's why my interest was playing guitar. Like people who do bar bands where every weekend they have to play something. So that's a very good experience of learning how to do that stuff.
Yeah. And you would get the sense of like if you shoot a lot of weddings, I would suppose that you kind of begin to recognize the genre and the structure of the event so that you can kind of predict where you should
Yes.
place yourself. You have a sense of the kinds of shots that you're going to get at different times of day and
You scope
that
out the
gives you
church and know where you're going to
oh, yeah.
stand, all that kind of stuff. And people did pretty much do what if you're the photographer, they'll get out of your way most generally. Um, but yeah, there was a lot of learning I got from that. So I'm not saying people need to do that,
Mhm.
but it's sort of you know, a trial by fire kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah.
But eventually
Well, and
digital came along.
yeah, I mean, it would certainly force you to learn your craft.
Yeah, but I never shot I mean, rarely would I was able to shoot my own stuff.
Yeah.
I often feel if had I not done that, maybe I would have just dropped out of it. But I think I might have been, it would have been advantages with that. Excuse me. Anyway, digital came along and I was intrigued by it. And then I discovered Photoshop. And after being a big darkroom person, this, like I like to tell people, that was like giving me the keys to a flying car.
Yeah.
And then I was off to the races. I ended with a Nikon D70, which is what, seven megapixels.
What
And
are you gonna do
here,
with all that data?
yeah. But and I'm a geek, so I enjoy working with Photoshop. Where
Yeah.
a lot of people don't like to do post processing. I do. So I think I'm fortunate in that regard. So here I am. That's where I
Well,
became
that's
to.
great. I mean, and it is, I mean, it is interesting with this kind of pursuit, profession, hobby, depending on however you engage with it. There are so many different facets to it, so there's the actual, the business of it, the connection with people through it. There's the technique of it in terms of, the camera, the dark room, the processing. There's also, I think, and this is something that I've been trying to think more about is um, with any kind of thing, if you have some goals in terms of, you're not just taking pictures, but you're actually trying to take a certain kind of picture,
Mhm.
that begins to drive maybe your sense of achieving something that matches your vision for what you're trying to achieve. And over time, and we've talked about this before, this idea is you develop your sense of how you see.
Yeah.
And so you end up seeing more because you spend a lot of time looking for the thing that you're trying to take a picture of. And that has, I think, a very hugely beneficial impact on, just what happens when you go out. You get luckier with practice, you get better at maybe coming back with something because you are prepared for what you're going to do, and that's a very satisfying feedback loop, both creatively and in terms of output, whatever output means to you.
Yeah, I would say as far as the business end of it goes, I mean, if you like, I was having to, sort of go and promote myself and you have to worry about people getting paid and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of effort. So
Yeah.
it expends a lot of your energy into that. If you don't do that, you have more energy to spend with photography. What's the main drawbacks, actually? So, excuse me, yeah. Okay, I got cough drops going here too. So,
Well, we can pause and you just take it easy there.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I think what you're talking about, you say you have to learn to see,
Mhm.
and no matter how good you can learn to see, though, that doesn't mean it's going to work. But that's one of the most important things to do. When I had a friend that was a newspaper photographer in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and he created these gorgeous black and white photographs in the newspaper darkroom of all kinds of civic scenes and things like that. Like he had this really good photo of a guy pulling a bow, the
Mm,
archery competition with the string on his nose like that. Beautiful photo, and he was always into the peak of the action. That was his main thing.
right.
But that, as beautiful as that photo was, the guy had such a terrible looking face, expression on his face. It's sort of completely distracted from the beauty of the photograph
Mhm.
because he was looking for the peak of the action when he actually caught the bow at that moment. I think if you would have relaxed, just be after the moment or just before that moment would have been better. But he steadfastly went for that peak of the action. And I was also shot photos at 4-H fairs, and he would be standing with me, and he would take pictures of the people getting blue ribbons and red ribbons and so forth. And he almost got sued once because he had a young man who had blue ribbon sheep. And if you ever watch these sheep, they're always walking around or moving and walking sheep while they're all in line with the judges are talking about it. And this guy with his peak of the action, when he got awarded with the blue ribbon, his head was with a big smile on his face, looking straight up in the air. he caught this photo on the front page of the newspaper, but he had this sheep's head stuck right in his crotch.
Oh God.
And the parents are really angry.
Yeah.
But he was going, I don't know, man. I thought it was a great shot.
Yeah, that's I mean that is something that comes, you hope that you don't catch people in kind of weird or embarrassing
Yeah.
or just you catch stuff on the camera in terms of a bad look on the face or something, that could still be a very good picture, but the person might not like it very much.
But he seemed to have a knack for that. So I think, it's an individual thing. Like maybe some people have like, oh, like when the street photographers get these uncanny coincidences,
Yeah.
they have a knack to capture that stuff. I don't know how I could actually go out and try to do that.
Well, I took a shot the other day that was kind of fun, where I was just in my neighborhood walking down the street, and we were just going out for brunch or something, and this really interesting guy, actually a whole bunch of interesting guys, were just coming out of a establishment, and this guy had like huge hair and just a really interesting kind of lively space or face. And what it turned out is that there were a group of guys who were going to an event, a Vancouver facial hair
Oh
competition,
boy.
where all these people with, and I should have gone. I wish I
Yeah.
had, but I didn't. But he was very friendly. He invited me, gave me the card and everything. And so we're just chatting. And I said, "Yeah, hey, can I take your picture?" And he said, "Sure." So I'm standing, a meter from him maybe, and I have a 28 millimeter camera, black and white, and just took a shot. And what's kind of, it's kind of a funny expression on his face. But part of people, I think, who, well, it depends on their what they see or what they chance upon. But a lot of folks are really good catching people animated, and a lot of people when they're animated, like that's, I think, the beauty of candids, when like, and why people kind of would prefer to get a candid than a posed image sometimes, because you seem to capture someone kind of unawares, and you capture them a little bit more. And so this picture, this image, it's maybe a street portrait, because I asked him if I could take it and then took the
Oh,
shot. But it's a lovely shot, I think, because it shows a lot of vitality of the moment. It kind of captures him the way I saw him. But with a 28 millimeter lens, I have to be really close to get that. So that worked out really well. But it's entirely possible that his eyes could have been closed. Kind of a weird, other things could have happened. But I would always prefer to have a picture of someone so that they look at it and they would be happy with what they see, as
yeah.
opposed to, oh, I wish that picture did not exist.
Right.
So,
Yeah, that's one thing you always wonder about. Will the person like the photo that you take of them?
yeah.
Because I don't want anybody to think my a photo I take of them is be disappointed in it.
Yeah, I was telling my spouse this earlier today. So as I was on this night walk last night, I was just taking pictures all over the place, and I purposely walked across some areas that I knew would be interesting. But I kept coming across people who were smooching in the dark, and so I mean I didn't get very close or didn't seek out a shot, but I certainly got a couple silhouettes in the distance. So spring is in the air here,
Yeah.
so it was kind of fun.
Yeah, I had an ex-girlfriend and I was in Paris, France in 1973 or 20, yeah, no, 2003. And I had this idea of walking down the Seine
Hmm.
and making out or something on the Seine. That is the most well-lit place you could ever go. You cannot find a shadowy place in that anymore at all. So,
Well, and that's probably where you go to make out with people, because it's a scene. But like if I've noticed, like when I've traveled in what a strange topic. Sorry to introduce it. When I've traveled in Mexico before, in Latin countries, or sometimes in where else where have I seen this a lot? Like in Taiwan, seeing the young couples out at night, and just like, this, in some cases, the public space is really the only space that they can get away to
yeah.
be in contact. And so you see these kind of make-out things happening all over the place. So it's, again, so the liveliness of kind of catching life in the street and doing stuff like that, it's, there are a lot of potential boundaries there in terms of what I would want to do, but it also is a way to try to bring back something from the vibe on the street, the whatever's going on,
Yeah, I
be
think
it festival or whatever.
yeah, part of the whole atmosphere, kind of like they call the voodoo of a place.
Yeah.
There's no real voodoo, but I like to use the term voodoo. Like you said, the vibe or whatever, and you have couples making out and stuff like that. It's just something, there's something alive
Hmm.
about
Yeah.
that.
Well, and I think, the street photography, or actually the wedding photography, whatever photography I'm most drawn to when it involves people, and I think perhaps with landscapes and other things too, but especially with people, is when you kind of take something of the feeling of that moment that was captured. Now
Yeah.
it's artificially framed and extracted, certainly, but if you are at a wedding and you get a shot of people thoroughly enjoying themselves and
Yeah.
connecting, that can come through. That can be conveyed through the photos
Yeah.
or not. You get these flat ones too.
But that's not one thing I will ever do again is another wedding.
I had a lot of fun. I went to an old friend's daughter's wedding not so long ago, and again, I was there just with a 28 millimeter lens, one lens, and like, well, that's the only lens on that camera, and shooting black and white. So I did that because I knew that everyone else in the place would be shooting with color and
Yep.
using using iPhones or using, telephotos and such. So I gave for all the pictures that I took, and but they absolutely are different than any of the other ones. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, with weddings, there's so much a formal photography kind of situation, especially when you have the large groups, you have the bride and the groom and the altar. But the more casual, candid shots
Yeah.
are what really bring life to it.
Yeah, when my son was quite young, we went to a cousin's wedding, and people often they put those disposable cameras on the tables to get people to shoot. Well, my son
Yeah.
discovered that there were all these cameras around to shoot, so they probably have a pretty high quotient of shots taken at waist level by, he was probably 6 at the time, of people's butts and feet and all kinds of. So they've got a whole collection of those from those cameras. I'm not sure they were entirely happy with that, but that's how it goes.
Well, yeah, that's part of the game, I think.
Yeah.
But you mentioned shooting with a black and white camera. Wow, what advantage do you have doing that as opposed to shooting raw and then converting it to black and white?
Yeah, and I don't, I think that they're doing a conversion of a color file is, leads to really good results. And um, I think that I can get to an output through that kind of transformation that's just fine and actually works really well. And I have advantages doing that than sometimes being out with a monochrome camera, because I can use the color channels of a color image in order to kind of, create an effect that's maybe similar to putting a filter on a camera. We talked a bit about this in a previous
Yep.
Sunday. So I think the kind of visual output that you can generate now with the various tools and filters and processes really land you in a good place that you can go out and turn something color into really interesting black and white. However, um, when I'm shooting with the constraint of black and white, and that's actually all I have with me, I'm typically looking for a different range of pictures. And so it's not the color or something like all the bright colors and maybe the contrasting colors that I'm going to get, because in fact, like if I shoot something that has, let's say 3 shades of red, I'm not going to see any of that on the resulting image. So I have to start to pay attention to the luminance of the scene in a way that's different, and think about the tonal ranges there with a grayscale relationship, as opposed to the way colors work against each other. And then if I have put a filter on the camera, a red filter, an orange filter, a green filter, yellow filter, what have you, and I sometimes do, I may have certain, like I'll do that for a reason. So I'm wanting to do something so that on a sunny day I've got this deep dark sky from the images because I've got a red filter on the front, as an example. Or I'm using an orange filter and I know that's going to do a certain thing to skin tones and things like that for other kinds of things. But it just changes the kind of pictures I take typically, but like not all the time. I'll take pictures wherever I am, but I'll look for things that have a lot of shadow play or contrast or texture or I it's really quite fun to shoot with a monochrome camera in a very bright day at noon because the sharp images, the sharp shadows mean that you have the advantage of playing with shadows, whereas if you're shooting color, you're going to, be very careful. You might want that effect, but you also know that that means that someone who's thrown partly in shadow is going, that's not going to necessarily be a good image. So you work light, or I work light differently, and that's part of the reason I choose to bring a camera like that. And for things like architectural shots and things like that, it also kind of can pull you in a different direction. That all said, you can do portraits, you can do like all these other things, but you might zero in on something slightly different. So the example I gave you earlier of the man that I photographed in the street with the wild hair and the facial competition dude, his hair is just awesome in black and white because every
Yeah.
follicle and the kind of the swirl and it comes out pretty white. It makes the picture in many respects because against a dark background, and color actually would probably just be it would mute that effect a little bit because I would be look those other components are in the image. So another thing that I find with some of the black and white shots that I go after or just happen to catch, or there's a it 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 strips down things a little bit. It's a little bit more minimalistic. It can be a little bit more minimalistic in terms of what you're capturing. The flip side of that is if you are shooting with a monochrome camera under a forest canopy, you can get really overwhelmed with the details, but then the interplay of the light and the dark can pull you in a slightly different way because it's starker than, all the gradients of color that you might see. So to me, it's, I try to, if I go out, I try to only have that camera rather than have a choice, because then I'm having to work with the fact that I have that constraint to help me along.
Now, my assumption is when you look through the viewfinder, what you see in the viewfinder is black and white. Is that
Yeah.
true? Okay, because that would be, I think, one of the main advantages of that would be so if you're seeing it in black and white, you have an actual visualization. You might be able to see, oh yeah, this is going to work better as black and white.
Yeah. And people, I think most folks can set their cameras so that if they're using an electric viewfinder, they are seen in black and white. But there are, for instance, Leica makes monochrome rangefinders too. So when you look through the optical viewfinder, you're seeing color, but you're shooting black and white, and everything is black and white. There is no Bayer array on the camera. And that's how folks shooting in the last 100 years were shooting. They were shooting black and
Mhm.
white, visualizing through an optical viewfinder. So I don't think you need to necessarily kind of strip it back to. I think it's nice to have through an electric viewfinder the black and white view, but I don't think in any way that it's necessary to still put yourself in a mindset to be thinking about the tonal range of black and white in terms of the image in front of you.
Now,
The
I
potential.
visualize if you were in a situation like, I don't know, my Nikon Z9 might have it, so I can just press a button and all of a
Yeah,
sudden I can see black and white, because that might be a cool way to go. I'm going to press this just to see if how it looks in black and white. I might go, yeah, oh yeah, this is what I'm really going to zero in on then. I think
yeah.
that could be a useful tool.
Well, consider it, especially, I mean, you have so many really interesting architectural shots. Architectural shots in black and white are just awesome from my
Yeah.
point of view. I just love them. And I love trying to figure out how to get better at that. And we've got some and fantastic folks in Weekly who are contributing black and white architectural and kind of, these beautiful shots. We had the one from Arn, or that was Arn from the Arrival in the airport with that big kind of
Oh
cathedral
yeah, yeah,
area.
yeah.
And yeah, so there it just kind of creates something that's very distinctive, and the sense of light and space can really be conveyed, especially in architectural structures. So yeah, I'd highly recommend figuring out the profile for that because you could probably just program it in, bring up a profile, and then from the camera's perspective, it would be showing you all of that, but you would have the raw image that have all the color information. But to visualize through your viewfinder in black and white and be thinking about that as you shoot can be very interesting.
Yeah, I do some black and white, and I want to do more of it. But my next
When
thing,
I when,
yeah, go
when
ahead.
I think of like you were showing, I think an art gallery or a museum near your home
Yep,
in some of the shots, like some of those shots would really lend themselves to a black and white approach.
yeah,
And it would be interesting to see because you have talked before about seeking out these sites at different times of day with the different light. So, it's possible that thinking about that in terms of only having black and white rather than color, it might draw you to taking in some different kinds of pictures.
that's a good point. And it's an IMPA building, so and yeah, it's only a mile away from here.
Hmm.
I need to do that more often, but they do have that wonderful light totem with colored lights at night. So
Hmm.
that would be kind of hard to capture. But, with a blue sky or turning into almost a black sky against those angles. Yeah,
Well,
that's what I need to play with.
and then when you think of what happens, like, what becomes different color segments on, let's say, the edifice of a building. Instead, when the window wells just become these dark, kind of holes,
Yeah.
you start to see the lines of the edifice differently. So, stuff like that with the lines on a building in the light and the shadow can really be accentuated.
Yeah, black and
Um,
white, it brings out structure and form. And of
mhm.
course, architecture is all about structure and form. So,
Yeah.
and something too, uh, somebody brought something up. Can't remember what it wasn't on Flickr. It was something about an architecture article, and they were talking about the narrative of architecture and the narrative of architecture photography.
Hmm.
So, have you ever thought about that? I mean, this is out of the blue, but how would you describe a narrative of an architecture photograph?
Oh gosh. There is, quite a lot of cultural value that we place in the kind of architectural vision of places, like the construction of public spaces and, often, if you go into some of these spaces, they've been designed to overwhelm us or to kind of really capture the sense of the space, the grandeur of the space, like go into any cathedral and that's a homage to kind of a certain way of representing cultural spaces. And then you have all the historical and other kinds of lines that run back depending on what kind of building you're looking at. So imaging that, you're, I think, kind of pulling from your own reference or even things that are new to you. Like if I travel to a place and I suddenly am dealing with, let's say, um, expressions of Chinese architecture or Japanese architecture in a space, I'm immediately going to be drawn to it, trying to figure it out differently because I don't have the grammar of that in me. Whereas if I see a Roman column, a Greek column, I kind of, I've seen a lot more of those, so I know how to respond to it. So like figuring those things out can be something that I think is quite interesting for folks. But um, some of the things that, there are ways in which people present buildings. We've talked before in terms of, tilt shift and the perspective and the geometry of it all. And then you often see people who are trying to represent the enormity of, let's say, a public square with all of the buildings in the background and try to, in some way convey that sense of space, that sense of place. So there does seem to be, and I don't think I'm very well versed on it, a whole grammar of architecture photography that's
Yes,
predicated on
you and me both.
the building. And then there's a whole genre of it that's focused on the kind of, human space within constructed spaces and the way people play with that.
This article talked about architecture itself. You take the history of it, how the building has aged, when it was built, how people use it, and how
Mm-hmm.
people live in it, and things like that. So there was a narrative there, but you don't really have that in photography. I what my and I'm not saying for sure about this. My feeling is that structure and form and line. That's the narrative and the way the eye travels through the photograph.
Mhm.
always can be guided by the way it's shot. Now how I that's how I think about it as narrative. I could be wrong, but that's where I'm going with.
Yeah, and you said this earlier about, with the waterfall, how it's quite possible that you can look for the postcard shots first, and you
Mhm.
you get those, and then you might dive in a little bit more. I had a wonderful day back, I think in 2013, wandering around at the Taj Mahal,
Wow.
a couple cameras, and we got there really early. So for a little
Yeah.
while, we had the place with not too many people there. And the whole initial period of time walking in there, I can't help it. I'm taking postcard shots, snapshots of all the architecture and everything because it was just so beautiful, and it had been designed to draw my eye. And you have the reflecting ponds, you have these
Right.
long lines of reflecting water and structure, and then the mausoleum in the background. So that was very much part of what was attracting my interest. But then I very quickly started noticing the people here are fascinating, and they've come to the event dressed up in, their best outfits. Everyone's really turned out. It's extremely diverse in terms of the population of people from all over parts of India, parts of the world. And as the kind of my time there, which was limited, continued, I was taking far more pictures of people within the space than of the space. Like there's an alteration of that, but I start to look specifically for people's interaction in the space. And then maybe another thing that's similar is that, visiting some of the big, palaces and other kinds of mosques and things that you see through that part of the world. Especially if I was wandering around, I would be looking for, like, so I can remember one, it was a staircase, and rather than a banister, there was like just a chain that had been suspended on the side of the wall. This was in Rajasthan, and a lot of the buildings there are built with a red sandstone. So what was really cool is like a lot of the colors uh, in India are very vibrant, like really, really hued colors everywhere. And so this picture, the staircase was painted, I think, like a bluish turquoise kind of thing. So lights were sitting up. But then on the side of the wall, the paint is worn away because over, you know, decades, people have been moving that chain,
Right.
and the chain has scraped the paint across. So, showing signs of distress. Like we've had some pictures recently, like old barns and that, where, you see the distress of time on the structure and the presence of people in the space and the structure, or, things like that. I love that stuff. And
Well,
and
that's
and
that's
it's
narrative of its
really,
own.
yeah, and so that particular little detail could be right beside this enormous, lovely structure that, oh yeah, instantly recognize that, but you didn't see the scratch marks on that door. Like old medieval doors in old cathedrals are wonderful to shoot
Yeah.
because you just see the movement of time on these, massive doors, and it happens to be attached to this beautiful cathedral, Notre Dame, but it's actually that detail of the door that's fun to take a
Yeah.
shot of.
In some places like Notre, very old cathedrals and things, you can actually find graffiti from the
Yeah,
1600s where somebody
yeah.
has chiseled in stuff in the side of it instead of spray paint.
Yeah. Or, like, there's a Saint Jude de, no, what's the one? I can't remember the name of it. Anyways, Notre Dame, before it burned down when I was in Paris, like that was astounding, just absolutely filled with people. Then I found another cathedral, similar age, that had not had all of the attention, all the restoration. It was a little bit shabby inside. I loved it so much more than Notre Dame because it had that sense of that time, and the
Probably
weight
fewer
of the
people
time,
too.
and fewer people. And there was a guy practicing some organ piece at the time,
Oh
so the
yeah.
whole cathedral was
Hey,
booming.
wait a minute. Could it be Saint Chloe Tilde? Was that it?
It might have been. It might
Yeah,
have.
I know where you're talking about then. Yeah, that's because when I walked through there, it erupted with pipe organ music.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And so then, finding these kind of odd corners in an old cathedral where there aren't a lot of people, and you suddenly start
yeah.
to see how the space is contained within the architecture. And if you can start to capture that, that's so interesting. Or the people in it who are in awe of that, that's also interesting.
So architecture, we were talking about architecture, but here's something. Now, I have a focus group in my photography club we have lawn, like landscape, architecture, wildlife, and nature. And we're
Mhm.
supposed to zero in on nothing but art, lawn with landscape. Uh, and I mean, I think landscape should be land, like
Mhm.
a pasture or mountain scene or something like that. But almost everybody, and I don't care. I mean, I like all these photos. Like, I also like cityscapes and seascapes.
Yeah.
So I think cityscapes in particular aren't landscapes, but seascapes, that's another story. So what would your thoughts be on that, and how, if you were trying to say, no, you can't be in this group because it's down a landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I'm now wondering, like, so I live right by the ocean, and if I take a picture of the Pacific Ocean, can I call that a landscape? I probably have. I probably kind of think about it within that genre, and I don't think that there's anything so exclusive about a landscape that you can't consider large bodies of water within that genre. But, perhaps there is then a group of people that measure the percentage of water in an image, to say, well, no, no, I'm sorry, there's not
Yeah.
enough land here, but that seems kind of boring. So
Yeah, and
I don't
also
know.
you see landscape photographers. I mean, there's you don't really have seascape photographers or cityscape photographers so much. They're always landscape photographers. I don't think there is a, I mean, you can be called, cityscape or something like that, but I don't think you have videos about how to do cityscape photography or something like that. So I don't think really
What?
people really care that much, as long as it is
Yeah, I
kind of.
don't know. I'm subscribed on Flickr to a bunch of the kind of urban and like, so like there's like, we're back to talking about genres here. Like you can talk about street photography, but is that street portraiture? Yes and no, depending on who you talk to. And if it's one, it can't be the other. And I think, well, maybe, but I don't know that that matters so much if you're interested in something you've taken the shots you take. But there are these categories of like, actually, there's a fun group on Flickr called Urban Flux, I think it is. And so people are contributing to kind of an ongoing narrative, maybe, or a set of stories. So you're kind of prompted to post an image and look at the other images posted, and they're all cityscapes of some or city scenes of some sort or another, maybe not scapes. And people are trying to kind of say, well, I'm going to put this up because I saw this one here. And then over time, it kind of evolves visually, depending on what people are putting in. So there are a lot of folks who are putting up like city lights or city panoramas and, or just, here's the Vancouver group for Flickr, right? That kind of stuff. And you see a lot of those kinds of shots. And certainly when people were starting to figure out the digital process for things like panorama shots, how do you do that for cityscape? So you see a lot of those kind of long panoramic shots of city skylines and such. So there does seem to be a lot of that, and that does seem to be a certain, like a lot of folks buy posters of cities and the skylines of various cities. So that I think is a pretty well established kind of photography. I just don't know how to contain it, describe it, or I don't feel that I have to care very much about that ultimately. Um,
Yeah, I agree. I don't think in our group, no, nobody really cares. So, excuse me, guys. So anyway, I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
but I think, like the other thing that I see people do is like they kind of focus on, nature photography, which I
Yeah.
think can be anything from a gosling through to a mountain range.
Yep. Oh
Um,
yeah.
so, it's just nature, but like in the part of the world I live in, um, you know, the interplay between the ocean and the land or the mountain and the forest is a kind of component part of things. So, I think that, going back to our conversation about waterfalls, there's probably a grammar for how people who are really tuned into what they're trying to show with the waterfall might at times include, citing it within a larger context. And, like we've had a couple of photos that deal with that in terms of how they present kind of a well-known objects like a waterfall. But then there are other people who are trying to do something different with it, showing the energy of the water or the destructiveness of the cut of, of the fall over the years against the rock, or the ruggedness or the height, or, some other relationship. So I think that there's, I would still classify a shot up a riverbed of a waterfall as a landscape. But it doesn't necessarily have to perform what a juried group of people would say. Again, I suppose if someone's presenting into a juried competition, they already have a sense of what the expectations are in terms of landscape. And so they're probably choosing something to suit that.
Yeah, I would think if you submitted something to a landscape exhibition, somebody might turn down a cityscape.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe not. Anyway,
Well, I think you're right. I think you're right. Now, but a park within a city, maybe not.
yeah, exactly.
There's those shots of Central Park in New York City sometimes that are shot in a
Oh yeah.
way that it's all about the interface between the skyscrapers and the big trees.
Yeah, I mean, like here in Bloomington, there's a really good, it's a fountain with, you know, a person laying there with water squirting out of it, and there's all these trees around it and stuff. And when you spread that all out, it's very much like a landscape, but it's almost like architecture or I don't know, sculpture photography or something like that. But I think that could be called a landscape. And
Mhm.
again, our group doesn't care. What they could probably put macro photos up here in the landscape. Everybody, oh yeah, I like that photo.
Yeah, but when you say that, I mean, at the same time, we often get critiques and responses from folks that are saying what you've presented this week is a classic example of this. It either is achieving or not achieving in relation to that. So, off we go. So people bring into their um, interpretations of the execution of a shot, assumptions in term, so if it's an abstract shot but it isn't quite abstract enough, people might say that's really not abstract but it's still good. So we do get people, I think, who are expressing either a discipline or a preference or a point of view that has addressed to genre.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you on that. Okay, next up, and this is sort of a transition from that because you're talking about gray areas between these various concepts. Like, where is the line between something being a photograph and, or is it a digital painting or illustration?
I don't know that I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, just to spitball it a bit, um, I like, like I think some people are they're a goal that a lot of photographers have is that they have a something that reproduces with a great deal of accuracy and a great deal of sharpness and a great deal of fidelity to what they imaged. And so, this idea of the picture is kind of predicated upon that. Other people, and I'll speak to me. I'm often far more interested in trying to get a slice or something more impressionistic, because I'm actually not nearly as interested in, let's say, getting the entire image of the thing. I want to pull something from the thing, often by making choices either in terms of shutter speed, but mostly through the aperture or my lens choice to isolate something from the context. So, when I'm sometimes not so successfully, but still with with an attempt, trying to do really narrow depth of field stuff. What I'm trying to do is more paint with the blur to set out in some area of focus something that I found interesting. So I'm purposely doing that because that's the effect I want. Not always successfully, but sometimes, I bought a lens last summer that I just love. It's a 75 millimeter f1.4, and it's an older lens, so it's like 40-ish years old. It just has some wonderful qualities to it. And there were times last year when I was just starting to get used to the lens where I would bring my photos up into Lightroom and I'd look at something and I'd just go, that's, it looks more painted than it does photographed. Now, that's just my opinion, so it doesn't count for very much, but that's the kind of effect that I more often than not, especially if I'm shooting things in interesting light or with flowers or more macro or kind of isolated shots, that's what I'm trying to do. So, to me, I think that there are people who will do that with kind of hyper realistic kinds of things, and they'll push the color, they'll push the contrast, stuff like that. And then there are other folks who will do it through motion or through depth of field effects. And it's possible that in any of those approaches, that the aesthetic choice they're making is either hyper real, normal, or surreal or impressionistic. All are valid choices.
Yeah, generally the age old is between real photography and pictorialism
Yeah.
historically. And to me, and everything you're seem to be talking about is in camera.
Well, in the best of all, like I think I spoke to this on a response to a thread this week on one of my photos. Um, my strongest goal is to get it right in one exposure the first time. If everything comes together and I get it in one exposure, I'm happiest, and I'm trying to do that. Um, Post-processing opens up so many additional possibilities because sometimes I didn't get it right. I can recrop. I can adjust the exposure relationship through the various sliders and such. And that might get closer to what I wanted, or it might reveal to me something I didn't see at the time of exposure. Both of those things can be positive. But the thing I'm trying to really do is as much as possible with that initial exposure. And I keep saying about exposure because that's kind of how I shoot. I don't do I'm not using a camera I'm going to do like 10 or 15 exposures. I'm going to like maybe two or three if I'm being kind of really excessive. But I'm trying to get it right in the camera as much as possible so that it's already close to where I want it to be framed. I'm not having to crop in, or I hope that I've already baked into the file the kind of exposure effects that I'm hoping to capture. But I don't get it right a lot of the time.
Yeah, it pretty much that's I had the same idea with myself because I consider myself a photographer as opposed to a graphic designer.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, I'll use long exposures frequently, and I'm still wanting to play more with intentional camera movement.
Yeah.
That's all within camera.
But to get to the distinction you're making in terms of photography or impressionistic production or graphic design, I mean, this is where it's so wonderful to see how people's visual literacy or kind of reference pulls the people into different ways. So people are purposely bringing kind of sharp, contrasty images forward to make it a little bit more like a graphic image. It could be drawn and, purposely going out and it could be that they went out to get it, but they went out at noon to shoot where all the shadows are really hard, or they introduced that into an image that was suggestive to them that would be a good treatment. We had an image this week in Weekly, the one with the light standard with the one side that was missing. Do you remember that one?
I'm going to take a look at it here.
And it's an example that comes to mind to me because it's just a silhouette of a pretty nice light standard, but it's broken, and it's a very minimalistic image, and it's rendered in a way it's like it could be a drawn
Oh yeah, yeah,
image.
yeah, yeah.
So,
I took a picture similar to that in Paris with both lights, like almost the same type of light.
yeah.
But yeah, I like that. It's almost it draws to your imagination. It's
Well,
like
I'm sorry.
it's like a juggler. It looks like almost like a juggler
Yeah.
juggling,
And I
juggling
mean,
its head.
the presentation there, I mean, that could be a drawn graphic design image, one, but it's also playing with the missing element there is a hook to
Yeah.
because the symmetry is off, and then the way it's cropped is again just suggestive of that could just be a silk screen quite easily, and it could be turned into one, of course, after the fact. But to me that's a really good example of like that is a photograph.
Yep.
But it's entirely possible that upon seeing that you could say, well, geez, I blew up the sky. Isn't that terrible? Well, no. It's,
Yeah,
you know,
because it's silhouette.
don't try to recover that sky. And I'm assuming Chris shot it because this was the intention. This is something that he saw.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Yeah, it's very like almost like a silk screen thing, but still, it looks like it came from a camera as opposed to something that was applied after the photo was made, like posterization, for example, or
Well, yeah,
something that was done to the photograph.
the posterization is not always added after. Like I did a shot a couple of weeks ago from a concert that I shared, and the greens had punched through everything. So you get that, or sorry, solarization, not
Oh, sorry,
posterization.
yeah.
Yeah, but that same kind of
Mhm.
graphic that visual or color distortion that sometimes happens in the camera. But then other people, they sometimes are setting their cameras so that there's a filter being applied as they go. And I prefer not to do that in camera. But again, I think if people are visualizing that that's an effect they want in a scene they're taking, that's a positive thing because they're making a choice about how they want something to look.
Now, I would hasten to add that there's nothing wrong with somebody doing like applying stuff to a photograph.
Mhm.
I just say that's not photography, and that's all there is to it. It's not.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a photography element to it since you actually are starting with the photograph. But if you were to like take a paintbrush and start coloring over that, the actual image is no longer a photograph, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I guess this is where it become, in a digital age and even before that, you know, I I I don't know how hung up we need to get on whether something's a photo, like if the output is photographic or not and what that actually means. Because I think that we have this broadening set of tools and approaches to visualizing the world, including photography, including analog photography and all of the dictates of that kind of analog approach. But it's I think quite wonderful in a lot of ways that people are pushing the boundaries of what is photographic, including with the introduction of Gen AI related images that you have photographers with a photographic kind of set of experiences who are now picking up another toolbox and kind of pursuing their art and it's not a photograph in kind of the strict definition of things, but the person who's doing that may have a very deep understanding of light and exposure and composition that they're drawing upon to do something. So it's maybe visual artistry, which might have aspects or components of the photographic kind of genre or medium. But I think it's really kind of creative and interesting now that people are both pushing through it as well as doubling down on kind of previous models of more traditional photography all at the same time.
Yeah, my quibble about it is, even though I don't, the people that do that, I'm not quibbling against what they're doing, is if I try to go down that road, I am not going to be able to do what I love the most, which is the photography end of it. Because I
Yeah.
think there's a high amount of skill, equal as much in photography with taking something and graphically altering it that's not photographic.
Yeah.
And
Now
you
you
could
did
make
talk,
flashy stuff really quick, but that doesn't mean it's any good.
yeah, you did talk about earlier, you used the term that, when Lightroom was made available to you, you kind of felt you used the term like a flying car, like
Yeah,
this whole thing
Photoshop.
open.
Yeah.
And like it's interesting there because the way in which you are constructing a photograph now looks very different. Like for some of them, especially the ones where you're using multiple stacks and things like that with focus stacking. That's a very different, like some people might say that's not a photograph anymore.
Exactly. I agree. I agree. A lot of people would. I mean, I'm, I think there's a broad gray area there.
Yep, yep. And it's lovely that it's kind of gray and a bit ambiguous, but I mean it's interesting that you have, from I guess my estimation, when you have found a way to kind of achieve a visual output that actually can't be achieved physically with a single exposure or with just a strict optical process, but you are kind of leveraging the presence of this digital space to kind of create multiple layers of focus, from multiple images, and there are other things that you could introduce into that. That's completely improbable in terms of the world, in terms of just taking a shot. And at the same time, it's leading to what I'm assuming for you are the kinds of outputs that you're wanting to achieve with your camera and your Magic Box in Photoshop.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to stay on this end of it. And I don't want to be down that bunny trail. That's something that's equally wonderful, but I'm going on 73 years old. I want to spend the rest of my life with my camera and what
Yeah,
I can do with the output of my camera.
yeah, yeah. It is a different bunny hole, and it's the one that you're choosing to dig in. But again, it's I think this is people complain that the value of photography and the field of photography is kind of been eroded because everyone's taking pictures. That's one potential. At the same time, the explosion of people who are visually presenting the world in all of the different ways, it's a time of extremely interesting, creative, and kind of
Yeah,
expanding ways in which people are choosing to do this. And I think there are many, many, many good things that are coming of it. At the same time as it challenges, some of the ways in which, photography was done this way in the past. And what I think is there's more than enough room for people to find whatever bunny hole or bunny holes they want to pursue at, different times.
equally
And
valid.
it's just so rich in terms of the tools and
Yeah.
that we have both in camera and communicating about it, as well as the digital dark rooms that we can now play with so amazing ease, so much amazing ease.
And what with the advent of the cell phone cameras, but cell phone cameras are like incredible compared to especially like the old Instamatic and
Yeah,
Polaroid cameras, for example. But 99, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it's something like 99.999% of all photographs taken were not taken by photographers. There's just people going, "Hey, look at this. Hey, look at
yeah.
here," that kind of thing. Which is,
And to know what does that mean? What does that statement mean ultimately? That someone isn't a photographer
well, I
because
think it's not a bad thing. I'm glad people are doing that.
yeah.
Um, but they're not giving any thought to it. The camera is doing it for you.
Hmm.
The algorithms inside the camera. I mean, they're pointing it all right, but that's about the
Yeah.
the gist of it. Where a photographer is going to put a little bit more effort. Even a little bit more effort will make you a photographer.
Yeah.
You don't have to know all the extreme details of everything, but as long as you're putting some type of effort, says, well, I'm going to change this around so that I can, especially if you can go out of the auto modes of your iPhone,
Yeah.
um, or if you just try something creative with it, as opposed to just the typical shots. I mean, then you are a photographer. That's still, those aren't the vast majority of the people aren't doing it and they don't care. All they want, and that's fine that they do that. I think it's a very useful thing to do.
Hmm.
But the line between digital, but also when you get farther and farther into it, though, is when like somebody will have a photo of where they'll take the smudge tool and move things around so it looks like an impressionist painting,
Hmm.
like a Van Gogh type of an effect or something like that. Which that to me that is definitely not. That's digital painting. That's not a photograph.
Yeah. One of the favorite projects I took on when I was just kind of getting my feet in digital post-processing, I had an old photograph from my family from, I'm going to say 1907, 1913, one of those two dates. And my great great grandfather, he had a threshing crew. And so that meant so I have this picture, was shot, like one of those long panoramas. You have a group of people who are basically taking the wheat off the field. This is in Saskatchewan when the province was still, pretty
Lots of
unsettled.
wheat fields.
Yeah, huge wheat fields. And so the effort to do that, you've got, you know, um, 6 or 8 teams of horses. You've got, 30-ish people there. You've got 2 or 3 steam engines that are driving, some initial machinery and stuff like that. And so I had a black and white version of this that was all kind of, somewhat damaged and everything. So I had scanned it in. And then I basically I painted it. I painted colors into it. So my great 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 grandfather Tim Murphy, or I can't ever figure out how many greats to put in front of his name. He's wearing purple coveralls, which I'm pretty sure is not true. But I basically painted all these people, some of whom I I had reference to because they were family, but there were probably a lot of people that were also family. I have no idea who they are. But that whole act of interacting with this old photo that now, I mean, was from my family, but now through that process of painting was now mine. So that's not me photographing. It's digital coloring booking, I suppose, in some respects. But it kept me pretty connected to this photograph of my family, and it means more to me now from that. And so there is something photographic in there that's happening, or from which an artifact is being turned into something else. But again, I think it's wonderful when people maybe cross that line to know that you can go in and change something on this, as simple as a crop to as crazy as doing, putting an effect in, turning into black and white, doing any number of things. Because I think then people are taking a little bit more control over what they want to do with visual images, and that itself is a powerful thing.
Would you say what you did is a restoration?
It was a restoration without the intention to um, get it to a state of what it was when it was when it was initially printed. So I did have to do a lot of repair. So I repaired it, using the clone. I should really go back and do it again because the tool, like I was having to do all my own masking and everything. So, the tools now are just so much more powerful now to do that kind of
Yeah.
work. But the really what's the word I'm looking for? Attaching and engaging activity for me was being zoomed into this image as I'm painting it and choosing colors, I had to bring skin tones up, I had to bring clothes up. And very quickly I decided, well, I'm not going to give everyone kind of burlap clothing. I'm going to let's jazz this up a bit, and then figuring out, okay, so what kind of sky am I going to paint? So let's make it a big saturated blue sky with some swirls and things like that. So I think that anything that one does, either in the camera or in post, that interacts with the image that you have in front of you or that you want to create is in the same direction of what you might be doing if you're just trying to take a good photograph. It partakes of some of the same sentiments.
Yeah, and you're probably the people that be most interested in it would be your ancestors. I mean, you
Yeah.
might be long gone, and people are going to look at this, go, wow. And that's going to have
Hang it on
value,
my wall. It's one of
great
the
value. That will have great value to those people, including you.
But
So,
again, I think that one of the things that I think makes someone a photographer, regardless of what kind of device they're using, is when they start thinking about, I see something I want to capture, and now I want to, I want to do something with this. And that might just be sharing it, but it might then be improving it, fixing it, isolating, cropping it, whatever. But that's the start of, I think, a little bit more care and thoughtfulness, which where you said earlier that, like sometimes people just take a picture, but they're not thinking about it. But once they start into that, they start thinking about it. I've seen that with friends who've gone from no photography when it was just about having a actual camera to kind of dabbling now that their phone cameras are pretty good to actually doing a lot of photography just through their day because they want to share things they're seeing. And I think that and it's not necessarily that they see themselves as a photographer, but they're sharing the visual world around them. So I'd call them a photographer.
yeah. I think, of course, restoration, that's kind of a whole nother genre.
Yeah.
Okay, here's something that came up in discussions this week on Flickr, on the weekly, about how do you deal with flaws in photographs when you judge them? I don't know if you've read any of those or not,
Not
about
sure if I came across that
blemishes.
one.
It'd be discussions. And I've been tempted to chime in on artist intention.
What's in that one?
Um, well, like there's kind of between Fernando and Roberto about technical defects need to be paid attention to, and Roberto is or Roberto is like more interested in, well, he's not like more interested, but he thinks that's important. Where Fernando, he shouldn't have so much emphasis on paying attention to technical imperfections.
Well,
And
yeah. So I'll scan this a bit as we talk, but I mean, I'll maybe focus in on one of the shot I had this week in Weekly of the dog in the RV.
Mhm.
It's a flawed photo. There's no question about it because I did not nail the focus. but I still like the image. So, I think a reasonable question for me to think about is like, so why share something like that? It's possible that, like, I think a lot of flawed photos have enough going for them in terms of the moment or, some aspect of what's captured, that even with their flaws, they are worthy to share. Let's put it that way. And without question, I think someone can go into a shot that's beautifully executed, absolutely ticks the boxes and everything around exposure, composition, and that, but it may not be a very interesting picture. It may not be very compelling visually. It could be extremely competent, and I admire folks who can bring those two things together. So it's absolutely well executed and interesting to look at. But I've seen so many pictures that have been shared where, there might be something off with composition, or there's something there that, like, you wouldn't think that this is exactly how you'd always want to produce the image, but how it's been done here, like sometimes with motion blur or the focus or the exposure, like it works. So sometimes we've seen images that are very, very underexposed, but because of what has been captured there, it adds a quality to the image. But you might say, well, it'd be better not to underexpose, but it's possible that then you wouldn't have that image. Or again, with people who, I sometimes am pointing out to folks if I see blown highlights, and I blow highlights all the time, sometimes they really detract from the image and are distracting and are they kind of unwind the execution of the image in a way that's not great. Other times it doesn't really matter. So like then the silhouette we had up earlier with the late standard
Yeah, you could say
does
those are all
not
blown highlights. Yeah.
does not matter one bit to me in terms of my assessment of that picture.
Yeah, they may
In
be
another picture, it might because it strips out details or it's, something's not working
the blown highlights add value to that image. That's
in
the
that image. Yeah.
yeah, where
And
the
when,
blown highlight could deduct value from an image. It
yeah.
all depends on how it's presented.
So again, the idea of flaws, I think that becomes, I think, highly subjective. Now, there is a difference, like if a flaw in the image is there's a bunch of dust spots that someone has just left in that could easily be remedied, or people aren't attending to their frame and there's, I submitted a photo to Weekly once and I didn't even notice there was a microphone sticking out of this guy's back. Um, you know, it's a flaw. It's also what was there at the time, but if I wanted to kind of make that picture a little bit more polished, I could have taken that microphone off out of the guy's back just in an instant. But so those are kinds of things that can be interpreted as flaws, and I think some of them are, some of them it's more debatable.
I would say one an important thing to keep in mind is when we submit these photos to the weekly, they're subject to critical review,
Yeah,
as opposed to, oh, this is a funny picture of my cat. If people they're not going to go, oh, well, this cat isn't centered right, or this paw really leads off the edge of the frame. They're just saying, yeah, right, that's funny.
yeah.
So the value in that photo in that context is fine. But when you actually submit it to critical review, like in the weekly, that's when things get more technical.
Yeah, and I think that's appropriate for the venue and for the community into which you're presenting that. Speaking of cats, I some time ago I submitted a picture of my cat Perry. It was a black and white image, and I submitted because of how he was composed, but mostly his eyes and his face because he was looking really mean. But his front paws were not in sharp focus, so people rightfully pointed that out. They're like other aspect, but this could improve the image, and they're absolutely correct that that would have made it a better image. But it's still a good, from my point of view, it was still a good image, even with that. Is that a flaw or just, that's just the way it is? And if you look back in history, our sense of what's a good image includes vast numbers of ones that would have flaws that, probably some of the folks in Weekly would say, well, you really should try to do this differently. And
Yeah.
could be right, but it doesn't make it necessarily a bad image.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it's also, if you have flaws that people are noticing
Mhm.
and and then that people are going to talk about, do you want your photograph to be talked about, those flaws to be talked about? Or do you
Yep.
want that photograph to be what your subject is?
Well, that's a really good point because I mean, I know I've gained from the feedback where, going back even to, well, actually, this is one of your comments. A few weeks or a month or so ago, I submitted a picture of a guy on a military ship, on a Canadian naval ship with binoculars. And I had composed it so that I had a flat plane, but I allowed kind of a swoop from the front of the ship, the bridge, to also be in the shot. It would have been a stronger shot had I, just had that one plane. I think that was your comment. So in the guard dog in the RV one this week, when I initially had that up, I included a little bit of the driver's cabin in front of that RV because I wanted to signal to a viewer that it was an RV just in case they weren't clear. But then I decided that, well, no, it's better if I just have that one plane, that the set of panels there.
Yeah, you
And
often
so
have to weigh those things. Yeah.
yeah, and so you're always compromising when you frame within the viewfinder, but if you do any cropping, but that was really good feedback to, because it kind of encourages you to think a little bit more about, okay, what's in the shot? Why is it in the shot? And then, I think less is more is a pretty good bit of advice, because it can kind of concentrate and simplify things. So, again, I think it's reasonable for people to take up composition like that. Just, how have you framed this? And you can take that in and then kind of be thinking a little bit more intentionally or carefully about how you frame things. But then, other kinds of flaws, there's flaws around exposure, there's flaws in, well, how something's been captured, how something's been processed, overexposed, underexposed, flat tones throughout, any number of possible things. Um, when it shifts to, like we've had conversations in the past around things like, like I like old lenses that bring distortion in, as an example. I don't consider that a flaw in the image. I seek out that kind of distortion or other kinds of optical effects of that sort. And it's possible it doesn't work on an image, but sometimes for my eyes, it works the way I want it to. So some people will say that, you could have a far more modern and clinical optic here to achieve something, which is true, but that might not be what the photographer is wanting to do. So I like the latitude of that, because we do have people who are, we get some people talking about a flaw in a photo because it's an analog photo. Well, that's not right. It's an analog photo will show film grain in a way that a digital won't, but that's not a flaw. That's a choice of the artist or the photographer. And I think that people are sometimes a little bit fast and loose in terms of what they point to as a flaw.
Yeah. I would say, well, as long as with the old lens, it wouldn't hurt if you include, this is an old lens. Actually, the
Yeah,
makeup and stuff like that. And people, then from in that context, you can see, oh, yeah, as opposed to if your camera data said you had a modern lens, you
yeah.
say, what
Well,
happened?
yeah. Ferdinand had a picture in the pool a few weeks back where there was a lens flare, and someone pointed to that as a flaw. I looked at that
Oh,
and said,
yeah.
"Hey, I love that flare." So I will seek out, I will shoot purposely to bring a lens flare in because I want that presence of the light beaming in, because it's going to maybe create a rainbow. And on some lenses, I know how to not just create it, but where to place it because of the angle against
Yeah.
the illumination.
Well, you can sure do overdo lens flare, but no, I mean, yeah, that could definitely add to it. And it's not exactly like what you'd actually see with the human eye either. This is something, an artifact is brought in,
Yeah.
which is another interesting concept to think about, which I won't even talk about right now, but that's part of how photography works. But probably my biggest beef with flaws in photos, okay, first of all, if you have a tilted horizon.
Yeah.
So, and I almost never, free flight a photo because of a tilted horizon, but I will point it out. I'll even
Yeah.
tell my how many degrees off they are. But if your horizon is tilted, that's probably going to be the first thing people are going to notice.
Yeah. Unless the tilt of the horizon is aesthetically um, connected to what you were trying to visualize. So I've
Yeah, if there's a
seen,
Dutch angle, for example.
yeah, a Dutch angle is a good example of
But
that.
if it's a classic type of landscape photograph or
Yeah.
the seascape,
Yeah.
and it's tilted, and that's probably gonna, and maybe it's just me, but I think most people go, well, that's tilted. That shouldn't be brought into the equation of evaluating the photo, in my opinion. So why not give that little extra oomph to straighten that out? But then, and again, I won't disqualify a photo because of that, although I pointed out. But my biggest issue with most flawed photos for me is over processing.
Yeah.
People go way too far over processing way too often. And I and there is a and people will argue against it. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That adds character to the photo. It's or any number of reasons why they think the over processing is fine. It makes me feel like they're just being lazy or making excuses.
Yeah, well,
That's my cynical reaction to it.
but I mean, that's a good example because I think the first few shots that I shared with you that were lower light, black and white, you helped me to see that they were infested with digital worms that
And you
were
didn't
just,
even know. I bet it was that Photoshop thing with the
yeah,
40 points of
that's
sharpening.
the one.
Wasn't your
And
fault.
and so, apart from sloppiness, I think you raise to awareness, like, especially for the kinds of pictures that I often like where with a very shallow depth of field, you want a painted smooth background. Well, if you leave it to Adobe's defaults, that smooth background is going to be riddled with and worms is an appropriate metaphor to use.
Mhm.
So it's very simple once you know that to not have that if you choose not to have it. And that's different than grain. So either
Yep.
high ISO grain or other kinds of grain can add a nice quality to an image if that's what you
A
want.
random grain, not
But
patterns.
it shouldn't be it shouldn't be the sharpening algorithm of Lightroom or Photoshop that's doing that to you unless you want it to.
Yeah. Well, again, some people will say, "Well, I like that,"
Yeah.
and I would say, "No, I wish I could remember the photographer's name. He's a famous street photographer. I listened to him on a podcast, and he was complaining about overprocessing. And his question was, where are the masterpieces? Like, except if that stuff is okay, why are we not seeing these in good or great photos? I mean, I I mean, if that's what you're after, maybe you're trying to create a new genre of your own, and you're cutting the groundwork for a new future photography, which I think that's not actually going to happen. But otherwise, why? How could this stuff be? I mean, why would you want that if it's not represented anywhere else? An example of a good or great photograph.
Yeah, so immediately brought to my mind Daido Moriyama, the Japanese
Yeah,
photographer. I'll share a link for you because there are people who are doing just that. They've made it here. I'll pull up a link. This is just a random article to his work, but his a lot of his photographs are purposely really gritty, grainy, black and white, often underexposed. That's his style. And his stuff is really cool. Actually, that just has one link that you look him up and you'll find some additional examples of his photography. But his stuff is really interesting. And there are some folks that I know of who purposely go out with like little GRX cameras, those little black and white ones, and or actually they are color, but they produce a kind of a grainy, high ISO kind of thing like this, and they're purposely shooting those kinds of shots, and so I think there are a lot of people who specifically look for that.
well, I think high grain is one thing.
Yeah,
And also, there are people who deliberately and consciously increase sharpening in order to achieve those artifacts.
yeah.
And to me, that's where you start to go into illustration and digital painting. And I think
Hmm.
that is fine in that regard. But the typical person, when you show, like, they'll have a classic landscape photograph that's filled with worms. And they'll go, well, I like it like that, and I seriously doubt that they really like it like that. If because you're talking about some type of the artifacts are kind of expressionistic.
Yeah, I shared a second link that has a few more of his shots.
Okay.
But he's worth looking at because I think that he's often using film, but his whole approach is one where he's playing with the grittiness of these kinds of images
Yeah.
as part of the aesthetic that he is striving for. and it makes them really interesting, moody and
Right.
intriguingly lit and textured kinds of images.
Yeah, I'll take a closer look. I'm pretty sure I've seen this stuff before. But what I usually encounter here on the weekly or and with Flickr in general is just it's over processing and for no good
Yeah.
reason.
Well, we've talked about this before in terms of, you know, the folks who are doing high dynamic range kinds of things, and you still see some of that where
Yeah.
everything looks kind of unnatural or everything is punched too much. You see it in terms of you know, the kind of haloing effect where
Yeah.
people
Halos
are
are really, yeah.
pushing contrast or they're masking approaches. And you know, I'm far more careful about looking for that now because I mean I see it instantly in someone's picture. So there are a lot of things that I think you can help people to say, well, you know, so you like this effect, which is a little bit more contrasty. That's fine. Be aware that there are ways to achieve that without making it so obvious that you've done that. So
Yeah, and it's a
there's
lot
that.
easier to get rid of halos than it used to be with Photoshop.
Yeah.
The
Oh,
selection tools
absolutely.
are so much better.
Yeah. Well, and it really is like I just think about the power of the masking tools now and then what that
Oh yeah.
affords you. It's stunning, you know, and the amount of time that it used to take to mask meant people didn't, but now it's like it's so easy.
Yeah, and you'll get with focus stacking, you'll frequently get a kind of halo. It's not because you when it's focus stacking, you're actually the image gets bigger
Yeah,
as it gets closer. So you end up with this kind of a shadow kind of part that
yeah.
isn't there that sort of gives a rim around it. That's like this very much halo-like. But so I always have to touch that stuff out. It's not hard to rectify, especially on the outside edges of a
Yeah.
flower, for example.
Well, and you made a point or a comment on an image of mine, which was a, you know, one of the shots with very shallow depth of field with a structure of, let's say, a flower, probably was a flower. So there are optical distortions that you can't really avoid. Like if you're shooting macro at a certain aperture that's very shallow, you're going to introduce an optical distortion into the image. You know, so especially if something's a little bit back from your focus point, it's going to you know, be blurred out beyond its edge, and that's going to just be an element that's baked into your image. So you can soften that and kind of be aware of that because if you then are using masks to kind of frame out or to change the interplay between some of those different layers, that will just augment that optical distortion that's already there. But it can also, you know, it also is part of what you're choosing to play with when you're using that kind of optical effect.
I would say more often
And
than not, that's a pleasing effect. At
it
least that,
can be, it
yeah, at
can
least
be,
you're
but it
trying
can
to get
also
depth.
be, yeah. But it's like one of those things, like in you know, in a successful moment, you've managed to keep the, you know, your subject sufficiently sharp, which doesn't necessarily mean entirely sharp for your intent. And like we had that wonderful image of skis this week, the stinknet globe chamomile,
Oh,
where you know the focus on the flower that he achieved is just
oh yeah.
perfect across that yellow ball.
Mhm.
Now, some people might say, well, what about the stem? Well, who cares about the stem? But you know,
I
like,
care about stems.
yeah, I know.
I take
But
photos like that. I think if
but
you
you know
do
what I
something
mean? So
like that,
like,
you need to have the stem in focus
yeah.
in
So
general.
but you know, it's like one of these things where like when you're playing around with these kinds of images, that transition from sharp to blur can both be a mechanical and a artistic choice.
You know, if that background was in sharp focus, this photo would be terrible.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's kind of I mean part of the fun and the constraint of working with like really fast lenses is that you can stop down to get a deeper depth of field, but then you lose that painterly quality.
Yeah,
And that really happens with like, you know, like when you're in shooting with like 1.4, 1.2,
yeah.
1, and I regularly am shooting with lenses that fast, you know, and with all of the problems that creates, but trying to harness that for the right circumstance, I find really fun.
Yeah, and then in Ski's photo there with I think the green grass is really
Yeah, I
cool.
love the grass. It
And
looks painted.
yeah,
Totally looks painted.
but it isn't. He did it in camera. I think that's
Painting
what's
with light.
important. And probably he did some, manipulation with the tones in Photoshop, but in general, it was true to the image, to
Yeah.
true what he did in the camera.
Well, and if you start to read folks who really geek out about lenses and optics, people talk about like how does a lens draw? And the quality of the drawing of the lens can detail aspects of its sharpness, its true rendition, the color cast, things like that. But it can also be how it distorts circles of confusion in relation to how it resolves things that are in sharp focus.
Yeah,
So
circle of
those kind of,
confusion is what depth of field is all about. If you ever
yeah,
Google it, it's all the mathematical stuff to it. That's the thing that stuck out in my mind is the circle of confusion. Oh yeah,
yeah, yeah.
famous term.
Lovely phrase. I think it's a Japanese phrase.
Could be, yeah, that sounds like Japanese, all right.
Yeah.
But in my focus stacking, I've learned that and of course everybody there's a sweet spot in every lens, which is the spot where the aperture where it's the sharpest. And
Yeah.
in my Nikon 105, it's 5.6, f5.6. So I'll do my focus stacks at f5.6.
hmm
Not much depth of field there, but with the focus stack, you get to pick and choose your depth of field. So
Yeah.
you get the maximum sharpness with that. And I've discovered if you even go a little bit beyond that, I think I can get down to f2.8 with my Nikkor. If you do my focus stacks of dandelion clocks, the fuzzy part of the dandelion, you get less artifacts where
Yeah.
the edges, it crisscrosses between all the different seed things. So, there's so many factors involved in what with depth of field and the circle of confusion that can change the whole thing. If you shoot that at f16, it's going to be all artifacts. It's going
Yeah.
to be
Oh,
terrible focus
diffraction will
stack.
take over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're getting down to the weeds there, literally with the dandelion.
Literally.
So, uh, but anyway, my main point here is how should this stuff be judged? And I think it's perfectly valid to judge stuff for flaws. I generally
Yeah.
won't free flight something, but will point things out.
Well, what I appreciate a lot is that, in the time that I've been in the weekly community, I've had really good advice and critiques that have helped me to see and resolve or have just a better sensibility in terms of things that could be perceived as flaws or problems. And it's given me the ability to make a change on that. So I've been able to I think be better at what I show and more aware of what I'm looking for before I decide to put something in. Which isn't to say that I won't I mean, I've put a couple cute dogs up recently, and each of those have their own flaws, but I also care about, I sometimes I want an image to be funny. Sometimes I want it to be image just because I like the image. And then I think that having a little bit more attention to awareness of and strategies to reduce flaws that don't need to be there, that's a very good service that the group provides. It's a little bit trickier when, what people will call a flaw is just more an opinion or a response to what they see in a photo, maybe compared to other photos they've seen. So I struggle a little bit more when someone will say, well, I've seen better sunsets. And that's the only, that's the only feedback
Yeah.
that's offered back. Because that's fine. I may have seen better sunsets too, but if the people can go to the point of actually offering, like, a critique to me would require someone to land it in terms of, okay, so I say that because these additional things you could have done in terms of framing, exposure, or whatever, would make it a more effective, compelling, stronger image. So, like when someone just dismisses it because they've seen better or they don't like it, it's fine for them to do that, but it's not helpful for them in terms of the expression of that in the kind of context of a group that's critiquing one another's pictures. So I love when people dig into the critiques and are kind of offering suggestions, having curiosity about, well, why did you do this and how did you do this? Or, you might think of doing this, because then I think people can say, well, I might do something like that, but no, I can appreciate why that offer was given, but I'm not going to actually do that because that's not how I shoot. Like, I think a couple weeks ago, I had a response to an image where someone said, well, you could have taken like, 12 or 13 exposures and picked out one with a better expression. Well, that's never going to happen. If you're walking down the street and you do a street photograph, and that transaction happens in a millisecond. You're not going to, or I'm not going to sit there and, reel off that many shots. It just wouldn't occur to me, and it would be rude.
Especially if they're
Um,
moving or something, yeah.
and you're moving through, and so like, that the genre of that kind of photography does not lend itself to studio lights, to multiple, it might in some cases, but typically not. If you're doing street photography, you do not have multiple exposures in any high number to typically work with. So, and if you do, then you're kind of shifting into a different kind of thing in some respects. So, the that kind of sense of, what is it that you are critiquing, the audience is going to be subjective. They're going to bring their own kind of points of view in the world to it, and we kind of balance through a lot of different people who, like, it's not like we take people through. There are great articles on Weekly from years past that kind of talk about, well, what are some good ways to think about critiquing? And I wish more people would read those, because I think what we're trying to do is to help each other understand what we see in each other's pictures, and that's a very generous thing that we're doing in terms of time and effort. And it's great when people are kind of doing it with a sense of, well, here's my opinion. I don't like your picture, and here are some of the things that kind of lead me to that. Or I'm challenged by this. This part's all good, but I don't know about, I don't like the color orange in Ski's picture. Well, that's a okay. That doesn't tell the photographer anything about how to change it, other than that person viewing it doesn't like orange.
Yeah, it's sort of subjectivism and all that, but yeah, I think the more people flesh out their explanation is always usually helpful,
Yeah.
as opposed to saying just, I don't like it, or, you know, one clause sentences about something negative. That's not that useful.
Well, but what has been really nice is, like, I think within the group, like, there's a lot of broad expertise, knowledge, and experience,
Yeah.
and people have been very generous to kind of offer insights, and even folks who are maybe newer to or exploring. The other piece of it is that if you've got a community of folks who are kind of open to, helpful and kind of constructivist feedback, then people will take risks. I love the fact that people take risks in the kinds of things that they put forward, because maybe they're trying to learn how to and explore how to shoot. And if you venture something and it just gets just shot down with a one sentence
Yeah.
comment, but no follow through, that makes it a bit less
Yeah. I
um,
mean, I sometimes will see
inviting as a
something
space.
like there was one with a flower that was laying as a couple of weeks ago on a street. And
Hmm.
I really liked it, except it just included too much information. I gave it a free flight. But my first thing was that I love the adventurousness of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I went out how much I did like about it, but these other things were just too much of a distraction.
So I think there's a lot of learning in the community that happens, and then also over time, if and you've talked about, you have a lot of involvement with photo clubs and other groups. Being within a group of people doesn't really matter who they are. That interaction and that kind of discussion about, and presentation to, and response in the discussion that follows is hugely beneficial for how you probably think about what you bring forward in the selections that you make. And it's been helpful for me, because I mostly try to put stuff that's fairly recent up, but I'm thought like there's stuff I don't put up, and there are other things I do. And I kind of think about, okay, so how is so and so going to respond to this? And I sometimes care about that, I sometimes don't, but it's in my head.
Yeah, I've got a lot of very old slides and negatives I need to scan, thinking I can post some of these, but I'm almost afraid to go, well, you know what? Those aren't that good. But I also lead a photo critique group on my photography club.
Mhm.
And what we don't do free flights or keepers or, thumbs up or thumbs downs or anything like that. Which I don't think you have, that's not necessary, because we have a group of people. They're not going to be, the photos aren't going to be taken down or rewarded or anything like that. It's just about discussion. So I sort of have a rule that you got to say something good about the photo to begin with, and then ask questions about it, and then make suggestions.
Yeah. Well, I
But
think in the best of circumstances, I owe the person a response that indicates that I've seen the picture, and how I see it and what I see in it is very much based on me. But I think it's really important that there's been, some observation with some thoughtfulness and a response as opposed to, you know, a
Yeah.
dismissal.
And yeah, I haven't been responded because I was traveling, but then I was sick. So I haven't responded to anything. I haven't even posted anything for 2 weeks, but this week will be different. Now, the last thing on a sort of related is pixel peeping.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on pixel peeping?
Um, um, it it's more often it decontextualizes a lot about the process on one hand, in the sense that if we're looking at a photo at, even 100% or 200%, I start to lose a sense of the broader context. But there are times when I'm needing to understand something, maybe there's something that I'm needing to pay attention to in terms of, let's say I'm shooting at high ISO and there is going to be more hot pixel or other kinds of interference in the image. Looking close might give me a better appreciation of that, and I can make some changes in how I process an image or how I shoot the image to begin with. So that relationship from a technical standpoint or processing standpoint is important. But too often, I think we get people pixel peeping, looking at very high resolution images, and we talked about this, I think, at our last meeting. If I'm putting a photograph up on the wall, big 20-inch image, I'm never going to be looking as close as I am on a screen necessarily. So at least putting back into context the idea of viewing distance. And, some folks kind of make a distinction between lower and higher resolution looking and what they see. And so sometimes I do that too, to look in at details of things, because that's maybe indicative about how well people capture detail, as one example. But I think it can also lead people down well, for instance, the sharpness rabbit hole. Can I actually see individual eyelashes on the person? And if I can't, it's not a good image, when in fact it could be a fine image. And that level of resolution actually is neither here nor there, but it becomes like pixel peeping can become one of those things where, because there are ways to talk about it in terms of metrics, it can be given a value, but it may not have a value in terms of the overall quality of the image.
Okay. I pretty much agree with what you have to say about that. I would say with pixel peeping, it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. Um, and I like to view photos at 100%, and I can discover things that can maybe help somebody learn to create a
Mhm.
better photograph, especially with people who are beginners.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people because they probably don't even know what's happening, and they
Yeah.
would be glad to learn how not to do it because most of the stuff is very easy to avoid. Where I have been accused of being said, well, you're not supposed to look at something 100%, and my temptation, my cynical temptations are, why don't you just shoot better pictures? So I think I think it's totally valid to look at something 100%. That doesn't mean though that just because you find these itsy bitsy things that are wrong, you should veto the photo or free flight it.
Mhm.
I mean, if it's crawling with it, yeah, that's one thing, but I think it's important to point this stuff out. You know what? Your photo can be better if you would have more value if you avoided these
Yeah.
artifacts.
Well, and maybe it's important for me to say that, or I will say, I don't know if it's important, that when you asked me the question about pixel peeping, I was thinking about it more in terms of how I get obsessed with the way in which I might edit or look at my photos. A lot of people get really driven into photography because they love gear. They love technical
Right.
specs on equipment. They love technical specs and resolution charts on lenses. And some of their goals are structured around identifying and acquiring the highest spec gear that can be purchased at great expense. And that's fine, because I like telescopes too, so I know the draw of fine optics and glass and all the rest of it, and quality optics in particular. That said, I don't think any of that chase is going to make you necessarily a better photographer. And you regularly have someone with a phone who's able to see something and image it in a beautiful way that might blow away someone who's acquired a very expensive set of APO lenses with high resolution, etc. So I think it comes down to like pixel peeping is a way maybe to kind of keep you honest and aware of the quality of the output that you hope to achieve. And some of that might have to do with the way you work your gear and the way you process things. But it can be an end in itself. And that's where like over time I find myself kind of detaching from a lot of the kind of lens gear kinds of discussion for and stuff like that. Like I don't even pay attention to most of that stuff now. It depends. If I'm thinking about getting a lens, I start to read up reviews and
Right.
how people are looking at the resolution and the edges and those kinds of qualities. That might influence how I'm going to make a purchase decision. But when I get into the pictures, it's more about trying to think about it in the broader context. So it's more that I think about pixel peeping in the context of people who are really focusing in on the gear, but as you put it, I mean, it could also be the output in relation to what you present into Weekly too.
Yeah, I think it also can make a difference between how you view your photos. Like right now, the the screen I hear is 47 inches. I got two 31-inch monitors to my side. So I'm looking at very large images where
Mhm.
a lot of people are either looking on a phone or an iPad or something much smaller.
Mhm.
So I think especially particularly people that just see it as a phone and think this is a fine image, but when you look at it even with an iPad or something, you'll see all these defects.
Mhm.
So I mean, I think some of the people only view for phones, they're going to be more apt to call a critical review like that pixel peeping.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of when Jan was here at the last one, we kind of reached a conclusion of some of the benefits, for instance, of printing off your images
Yeah,
and sometimes seeing them in a different way because like I know that I don't print so often, though I've been printing a little bit more lately. But that kind of gives me an opportunity to see pictures in off a screen on a wall at a different distance in different kinds of light. And there are so many additional things now that I have to think about in terms of paper, in terms of
yeah,
size, in terms of composition, because it's in the physical world as opposed to the digital world. And it's a lovely additional set of issues. But the aesthetics pull different. If your output is a printed image, you have some additional things you need to learn to be good at it. So
yeah,
another bunny hole
yeah.
to go down. And for some people, that's very much what they enjoy doing.
Yeah, and I think that uh, even though even if we can get away with a good like 16 by 24 print that still looks good, I think it's a slippery slope to go say, well, at 100% on a monitor, well, I see these problems, but I'm going to worry about it because it won't be noticeable
Yeah,
in a 16 by 24. I think you still need to fix those things
yeah,
just as a matter of principle. And again, like those usually aren't the things that I will free flight a person for, but I will bring it up.
yeah. That's
And I
fair.
will also say pixel peeping, one thing you can do on your own, I don't know how often you edit your photos, how if you go up to 400%, it's a lot easier to take care of little itsy bitsy places.
Yeah. I mean, there are some pictures that I do a fair bit of that. Like, for instance, I had one image where I was shooting through a window, and so there's all this distortion or all these little grainy things added through that, most of which were fine, and I was happy to keep them in, but some were not. So I actually developed a way to kind of go through and take the majority of them out because it led to a better image. But I often won't do that. And actually I mentioned this in an earlier one. I had a couple shots that I put forward in Weekly where I use the remove reflection tool in
Yeah.
Lightroom or in Photoshop, I should say. And I was fascinated because it introduced a whole bunch of really cool distortion, like how it does that with its algorithms, actually created this really weird and oddly aesthetically pleasing set of distortions that had nothing to do with the what I saw, but it was now part of the image because of what I processed. And I decided to leave them in because it kind of looks cool from my point of view. But it is, if I were pixel peeping for some kind of verisimilitude, fidelity to the image, I would probably be aghast and want to not have that happen.
Yeah, but there are gray areas. Maybe that would be good. It all depends on the output. It's one thing to talk about, it's another thing to see it.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're past 3 o'clock. I was going to bring up something that, because I was going to ask, you use Lightroom, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Photoshop. I use them both, but
Oh, yeah.
mostly in Lightroom.
Because I can't make I can make Lightroom work, but it doesn't make any sense for me because I have so many photos across multiple drives and I've shoot a lot of focus stacks.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense to import like 300 images in a focus
No.
stack. But anyway, I want to talk to you more about that at another time. So
Okay.
I would love to be able to use Lightroom, but it just doesn't make sense to me right now.
One quick thing I'll say about Lightroom, it's geometry tools, like we were talking about geometry once,
Yeah.
are pretty well featured, and I'm able to move pretty quick. Like it's to me, it's very efficient. It's reduced some of the tool set that Photoshop has, which is much broader, much deeper, to the kinds of tools like from a general photography processing point of view. If you're just working on a single image, or maybe you're doing some noise reduction, things like that, it's very streamlined. So it works well for me, but it's mostly because the interface, the tools and the interface and presentation is for photographs and like more single photographs. The minute you get into stacks and multiple things, yeah, it makes perfect sense to be in a different environment.
Yeah. Okay, Jeff. Well, I'm going to sign out, and
Okay. Enjoy your week.
I think I'm going to be able to do it next week too. So I need to double check, but I don't think I have anything going until September. So
I'm away next week, so I probably won't be here, but I'm glad that you're feeling better, and I hope you continue to make
and
that
get that raccoon out of your office.
good.
Every time
Yes.
he's kind of bob up and down
Yeah,
like
he's
these
actually
raccoons in your lap.
he's on a bike. I like this guy. He's a
Yeah.
very chill raccoon. We have some pretty aggressive urbanized raccoons in our neighborhood. So
Oh yeah, we do too. Possums and deer.
take
Okay.
care.
Bye.
Bye.